well, Dr. Emmanuel Abolo joins us now. Good morning, Dr. Abolo. Good to have you on the program.
Good morning. How are you? Thank you.
Yes, talking about corruption, integrity, ethics. Well, when we look at the Nigerian economy, we talk about the issue of high unemployment rate. We talk about high poverty rate. So what would you say is a correlation between corruption and poor economic development?
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. I must say that we need to take it at two levels, at the empirical level and also at the theoretical level. That's the way we discuss in economics. At the empirical level, the nexus between corruption and economic development has been well established. There is an inverse relationship between corruption and the level of development. In other words, the higher the level of corruption, the lower the level of development of a country. That has been well established, at the empirical level. So whether you are using linear equations or non-linear equations to establish that relationship, that is well settled in the literature. But let me just make this point, that there are possibly mutually inconsistent hypotheses about the relationship between corruption and economic development. And let me just give you these quotes. The former president of the World Bank, that's James Wolfson, had this to say. He said that corruption is the cancer retarding economic development. Clear. That means corruption, affects, development negatively. Then again, if you take that of the studies of Lev, Huntington, and so on, they said that corruption can be like grease, speeding up the wheels of commerce. In other words, they're saying that corruption is like grease that greases the economy and that it can boost commerce. So that is contrasting to what the former president of the World Bank has said. But before we draw any conclusion, let's listen to this. He said, if corruption does slow down economic development, East Asia must be an exception. Because while the region seems corrupt, that's East Asia, it is able to attract lots of foreign investment and generate growth. So you see contrasting views about corruption. But if you ask me, I would say both from empirical level and theoretical level, there's a negative impact of corruption on economic development.
Particularly when it has to do with like circular flow of income, when you look at it in that angle.
Correct.
Now, for those systems that you have mentioned, where you have the inverse, our first guest talked about, instilling ethics on a system, ethics and integrity in a system, rather than, chasing corruption as it is. Could be, perhaps could that be why those countries you talk about being more corrupt, but yet they are growing? Could that be what was applied there?
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. We've been hearing about corruption since the 1970s, where we said that corruption, if you recollect very well, that corruption is a canker worm. It's a popular saying. It's a canker worm that has eaten deep into the fabric of the nation. We heard that. But not every Nigerian knew a lot about corruption. But what has happened in the past 5 years, we have globalized. We have globalized to the extent that even an unborn child now knows that there is corruption. That's the issue. Now knows about corruption. People now know that you can steal 40 billion naira. Then they get you arrested, put you on the pages of newspaper, make a lot of noise about it, okay? And then before you know it, the person is walking free on the street. So what are we saying? We are fighting. Yes, nobody is saying we are not fighting. Yeah, we are fighting. It's like you are watching a boxing tournament. And if you're a spectator, you see the other opponent just hitting everywhere, hitting legs, and you think that he has won. And when the result is called, they said he lost. So the point is, are we fighting it the right way? We have made so much noise about it to the extent that people now believe that corruption is a business. And let me just make this point, that corruption is now a culture. is now the norm of the society. So it's not a government issue any longer. It's a culture. If you want to marry, you have to bribe. You want to get admission, you have to bribe. It is now in the DNA of Nigerians. So the approach. So,
but at this point, how should it be addressed?
Yeah.
You know, looking at it being, you know, if in our fabric at this point, how do you think we can get it out of our system?
So that you are not going into the realm of culture, value system, cultural change. Okay, it's not about government. Let's leave government. Because if you mention government now, then it becomes politicized. And somebody will say, we are fighting, we are fighting. Yes, you are fighting. But if you are fighting, you got 146 blows in 2018. Now you are getting 149 blows. You are fighting. Nobody is disputing that fact. Yeah. So there must be an approach, a different approach, a cultural approach, a change in orientation. We don't seem to hear anything about the National Orientation Agency any longer. It's a cultural issue, which even in the private sector, they fight such culture. Change the orientation. It's a huge, huge fight. It's not about, if you set up 100, EFCC agencies, even the people, the institutions you are setting up, are they not Nigerians? Are they not because somebody is wearing uniform, does it change anything? It doesn't change anything. As you're sending them, they can also be corrupt. They can also be corrupted because it's a cultural issue. So the approach needs to change. What I would say is that I offer myself free of charge. Don't pay any money. I can tell you it is the issue of changing orientation. It's the issue of dealing with this from a holistic, enterprise-wide approach. Okay? It is not about arrest. You have been shooting armed robbers for how many years now? Has it stopped? You've been killing bandits. Has it stopped? It means it is a cultural issue. And the earlier we deal with it as a cultural issue, the better for us. Because it is already in the DNA of most people.
Now, this brings us to, let's even understand that term, that word, corruption. Because when we talk about corruption, a lot of people think about financial corruption. There's also the issue of stealing of time. I mean, the time, even in the private sector, government sector, the time you're supposed to give to the organization that is, paying you salary. I mean, you're using that time to do something else. That's also, a corruption. Inefficiency, suboptimal work is also corruption. So how do we deal with all of those things? Is it still part of the culture we're talking about?
I hear you. That's a very, very good point. It's a very, very good point. You see, there are different dimensions of corruption. You see, you have public sector corruption, you have private sector corruption. We don't seem to hear a lot about corruption in the private sector, okay? There is corruption in the family setting, there is corruption at schools, there is corruption in channels, everywhere there's corruption. But 99% of people, Nigerians, it's in our DNA, we are corrupt. We are corrupt. Let's just face that fact. That's why it is a cultural issue. It is now a norm. Now, bribery is what we seem to refer to as corruption. That is just a tip of the iceberg. Corruption is a clandestine. It's a clandestine activity. It's a clandestine activity. And because it is clandestine, it is not an exact science. It is not an exact science. That is why Transparency International calls it perception. And people now think that perception is rule of thumb. It's not rule of thumb. The fact that they call it perception doesn't mean it is a rule of thumb because it's not an exact science. That does not mean you cannot model it. You can model it. But let's leave that alone. To respond to your question, I'm saying, since it is a cultural issue, we need to take a cultural approach to it. In order to take that blood from the DNA, to take that blood away from the DNA, it's a blood issue. It's like you see an armed robber now. You beat hell out of him here, beat him properly. He will tell you he will never steal again. In the next 1 second, he is stealing. He is stealing. So it's in the DNA. So that's what I'm saying. The government is really fighting. They're fighting. They are really fighting, throwing blows here and there. But the results are not showing what they want to see. And it can be very frustrating and annoying. We'll come to what government needs to do to score good points. I will tell them that. So since it's a cultural issue, we need to see how to come up with a cultural orientation. If we are going to use vaccines to take that blood away from, I'm telling you, that's the point. Because
corruption pandemic.
It's more than a pandemic.
Okay.
It's more than pandemic. Do I use a company's papers, for instance, to do my private work? Yes. Is that not corruption?
That's corruption.
So it's corruption. 99.9% of people are corruption. When you want to marry, don't you bribe brothers and sisters? Is that not corruption? You want to get admission? Is that not corruption? You want to get employment? You must bribe and all of that. Is that not corruption? So it's pandemic. Good point. It's pandemic.
Yeah.
So there must be a holistic, system-wide approach. That's why I said I offer myself free of charge. But I won't tell anybody free what they are to do. But I'm here free of charge.
But
Sure.
for you,
Now, you talked about telling, you have to offer a solution to the government on what to do, because we really don't
Okay,
have
I can
much
tell
time.
government now.
So please.
I can tell them a little bit.
The government what to do, even
Yes.
individuals as we are, we have to learn, because, I mean, if we have to change this system, it has to be from each and every one of us, from our homes,
Okay.
from our organization,
this change.
from,
Okay,
yeah.
let's start from individual before I help government. At the individual level, since it is a cultural issue, then I have to go spiritual. You have to go spiritual. If you have been trying to cure somebody of a certain disease, what do? They take the person to church or to the mosque, and then they cast it out. Jesus Christ was also casting out demons. There is a spirit behind this. There's a spirit. And we often say that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. If you have no fear of God, forget it. Forget it. Shoot the person, it's not going to work. So we have to go spiritual on that. But for the government, you want to score very well. You have been throwing blows. Which is so, you are throwing blows. You are throwing blows. You score 146 and now 149. Even if you make the argument that you are quarreling with, you have a right to quarrel. If you score me in an exam, I'm not happy with it, I have a right to protest. So it's a right. But the beauty of it is that this is being applied across all countries, not Nigeria.
Yes, absolutely.
And there are other agencies that are involved in this corruption index. It's not only transparency.
Absolutely.
And because transparency is the most credible, that is why you hear of transparency index. I can tell you there are other bodies that do this job. You have the Business International Index.
We know.
You have International Country Risk Guide Index. The Global Competitiveness Report Index. Before you have Transparency Index. To the extent that because Transparency International is credible, that is why it is celebrated everywhere. So the point really is this. There are certain parameters that they use in modeling corruption. The fact that it is perception does not mean it is not being modeled. There's a model, it's an index. So, are we looking at those parameters? Remember the case of the ease of doing business, if you recollect. We were not doing well. What did Mr. Vice President do, Professor Oshibanjo? He took it upon himself to look at the variables that they are using to compute this ease of doing business. Within a short period of time, Nigeria was now doing well. So why don't we follow the same model? What are those parameters that they are looking at? That's what, so if you are you are just hitting somebody, blowing people, and say you are fighting, you are not getting the result.
Okay.
So what are those parameters? You want me to talk about that?
Well, we really don't have much time, but we've taken the key points there for the government to actually look at those parameters that is being used for this and then deal with it.
Yes.
Okay, and maybe we would improve in this. Thank you very much, Dr. Bolu.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
It's always a pleasure.
Let me congratulate the government for the hard fight that they are making, but they need to fight harder and hit the punches, directly.
And the vaccine you talk about.
And the vaccine, take it.